Quite Right, a podcast where we explain random things. We're the explainers. I'm Brooke.
I'm Casey.
And yeah, each of us has chosen and done a little research on a topic. Neither of us know what topic the other person chose. So, let's do this.
They're not actually random things, I guess. There's not like any stochastic process behind it. There are things that we chose deliberately with intention.
I suppose they're not that random.
Yeah, this new millennial definition of random, where it just means a thing that's unexpected, I object.
I wouldn't say it's like a new millennial thing, because I've been doing that since like 7th grade. Anyway, my topic is The Legend of Zelda. Perhaps you've heard of it.
I have heard of it, in fact, because it's dominated my life and living room for about the last month, even though I've never really played it.
Your life and living room.
You see, so here's what I know. About 2 months ago, a company called Nintendo, of whom we did an episode about a while back. We did
NES. You did NES, yeah.
They released a new system called the Switch, wherein one can switch from a TV to a handheld console mode, and there's a game called Zelda for it, and you've been playing it a lot, and you just beat it. Anyway, it's like a wandering adventure game, and was it created by Miyamoto? Maybe I'll get to that anyway. And you play as a character named Link, and you go around hacking and slashing monsters in an action RPG type format. And it's one of, like, I know about Zelda. I feel like, what can you tell me about Zelda that I don't know?
Well, first off, the creator is unsure from at least the stuff that I was looking at, just to address that. Like, I'm sure Miyamoto was involved because Miyamoto did everything. But there are 18 different Legend of Zelda titles. Like you said, the most recent is Breath of the Wild. The very first was released in 1986 and is just called The Legend of Zelda. There was a subtitle that they used sometimes, but not all the time. So 1986 was the first one. The Adventure of Link came out in 1987, shortly thereafter, and was like a direct sequel to the very first one. And then you've got A Link to the Past, Link's Awakening, Ocarina of Time, Majora's Mask, Oracle of Seasons, Oracle of Ages, Four Swords, Wind Waker, Four Swords Adventures, The Minish Cap, Twilight Princess, Phantom Hourglass, Spirit Tracks, Skyward Sword, A Link Between Worlds, Triforce Heroes, and Breath of the Wild. Most of them were released directly for Nintendo systems, but the first couple were actually released for the Famicom Disk System. So after those two games had been on the Famicom Disk System, they were converted to NES cartridges at different times, not at the same time. But here in the US, it's a lot more famous for being an NES game than a Famicom Disk System game. The Legend of Zelda games have used a number of different formats. You've got top-down games like the original Legend of Zelda, side-scrolling, which I believe was the Adventure of Link, was a side-scroller.
It was.
And open world, which a lot of the recent games have been open world. They sort of started that with Ocarina of Time to take advantage of the 3D nature of the Nintendo 64. It was supposed to be, so Ocarina of Time was supposed to be released on the Nintendo 64 DD, which was a Japanese version of the Nintendo 64 that, like, from what I gather, never really got off the ground. So they kind of switched over more or less last minute to putting it on the Nintendo 64 instead. All of the games share a number of common themes and items and such. Probably the most common of which is Link, who is the hero. And a lot of the games, you can enter in your own name. Apparently, if you name him Zelda in the original game, which, by the way, Zelda is not Link. Zelda is not the main person in the green outfit. And people always get offended, like, at Comic-Con when I see Link cosplays. And I'm like, hey, The Legend of Zelda, go Link. They're like, I'm not Zelda. But yeah, it's a common mistake.
It's a really easy way to piss off nerds. I recommend you just go up to them and be like, Zelda! I love Zelda. You're Zelda.
Yeah, that'll really piss off a lot of nerds.
Yeah, which is great because they're really prickly and they're easily offended.
Anyway, so in the original, the Legend of Zelda, if you name him Zelda, then it unlocks a quote-unquote second quest, which you can also unlock by finishing the first version of the game, which has different dungeons and is harder.
But harder than the original Zelda?
Yeah.
That game's fucking hard.
It's really, really freaking hard. I know.
Okay.
Because I'm playing it right now, and it's very hard. I've never beaten the original Zelda. All of the games take place in the land of Hyrule. The game has this really deep and rich lore that has been developed throughout all of the different games, and each game has dropped like different bits and pieces of information. So like throughout the game you learn a whole bunch of different things. Like you learn about the existence of the goddess Hylia, and a couple other goddesses that like they together created the world. Anyway, the Triforce shows up in all of the games. The Triforce is in 3 different pieces, which are power, courage, and wisdom, each part. Usually Link is the bearer of the Triforce of courage, and the Princess Zelda is usually the bearer of the Triforce of wisdom. And Zelda is pretty much always, unfortunately, a non-playable character, but she can do some pretty cool stuff in some of the different games. Like in Ocarina of Time, she takes on the alias Sheik and uses like awesome magic powers to do a ton of cool stuff to help Link without revealing her actual identity. And in a couple other games, she is known as Tetra, another alias. And she's actually named, like, the name Zelda comes from Zelda Fitzgerald, as in F. Scott Fitzgerald's wife. Oh, yeah, and the Triforce's of power is usually held by Ganon, who is the common enemy throughout the series. Sometimes he goes by Ganon. In Breath of the Wild, he goes by Calamity Ganon. When he's a human, he goes by Ganondorf. And he sometimes appears in, like, demonish form, sometimes appears in human form, and sometimes he is, like, this massive boar. So the different games just have sort of different versions. And part of the game's lore, as you learn throughout time, is that the Link in the different games is not actually the exact same person, and same with Zelda in all the different games. She's not the exact same person, and same with Ganon. They're all reincarnations of themselves. Zelda is actually like a human carnation form of the goddess Hylia. Like, part of the way that she protects her land is by becoming this wise princess that has like this incredible power, and whenever she can't protect it on her own, then Link swoops in to save the day, and we get into like damsel in distress tropes that we're not really going to address in this episode. And then Ganon is always this reincarnation of himself, and commonly is like very purple and red and weird, and I don't like Ganon very much. In the different games, he appears in different parts of the game, and the map layout of the game changes a little bit. Usually the castle of Hyrule is right in the center, and then you've got like the Gerudo Desert, which appears pretty frequently in the different maps, but in different pieces of the map. And Death Mountain is always part of the map, but again it appears in different places. And anyway, the chronology of the games is not the order in which they were actually released. So the first game takes place pretty close to the end of the current chronology, except for now that Breath of the Wild exists. Breath of the Wild actually takes place like centuries later. But the chronology, you've got 4 games. You've got Skyward Sword, Minish Cap, Four Swords, and Ocarina of Time. And these are all like the original, like, set up the story. And after Ocarina of Time, the timeline splits into 3 different timelines. One timeline is called the Decline of Hyrule because Link failed to defeat Ganon. In the Ocarina of Time, he's Ganondorf. And so it branches off into this version of Hyrule that, like, is falling apart. And that's the timeline that the original Legend of Zelda is a part of. Then there is a version where Ganondorf was beaten, and that version is where Majora's Mask and Twilight Princess come from, which are pretty popular. And then there's another version where Ganondorf was not only beaten, but sealed away. And that's called A New World, because it's this, like, brand new world where Ganondorf doesn't actually really affect as much. But I don't know a lot about that. I haven't played any of the games in that timeline, so I don't really know exactly how that plays out. And then Breath of the Wild takes place way after all of these games take place, but we don't know yet which of those 3 timelines it's supposed to fit into.
So when do these timelines... Because I don't imagine that when they were making the original game in 1986, they were like, this is going to be part of an epic 18 trilogy that we're going to have as this convoluted web of timelines. I think at some point somebody had to say, okay, we got all these games. How can we like Lego them together into something that sort of fits into a thing? Like, who did that? When did this happen?
I don't know exactly when that happened. As far as my quick research for today's podcast shows, I don't think there was a time when Nintendo came out and said, like, yes, we have a timeline, like, we've been developing it since X date. But I think it was about 10 years ago, maybe a little less. All of these fans had created these different theories about how the timelines work, about how all of these different games fit in together. And Nintendo kind of caught wind of that, and they said, actually, we do have a document that, like, shows where each of the games fit in. And then a couple of years later, in I think it was 2011, they released a book called Hyrule Historia that actually shows that timeline, that shows like how everything gets set up and where it splits and all of that good stuff. So that's sort of my quick and dirty basic overview of The Legend of Zelda. Yes, my fellow nerds, I know I missed a lot, so don't be mad at me. But I love The Legend of Zelda. It's wonderful. And as Casey stated, I beat Breath of the Wild just a couple weeks ago, and it's super awesome, and I highly recommend it. And yeah, Nintendo needs to start paying me commission, because I'm pretty sure I've talked like 5 different people into buying the Switch and the game, because it's really awesome, and everybody should play it.
And I've actually never played a Zelda game. I've only seen it play. I played the original way back in the day, and I had no idea that all this lore had built up around it. And having heard you describe it, I am bewildered.
That's okay.
One day I'll return the favor by talking about Final Fantasy with you.
Sounds good. I just really, really like Legend of Zelda. FYI.
Cool.
Maybe you gathered that from my obsessive gameplay over the last month and a half.
Okay, we're back.
Yeah, we are.
Time to follow up The Legend of Zelda with a different topic of my choosing, which is not related to that at all, as per the usual for this format that we do. So what can you tell me about the F-35 Joint Strike Fighter?
It's a plane.
Yes.
It's a fighter plane.
Also.
It probably goes pretty fast.
Probably.
But yeah, like, I have no idea about any specifics of pretty much any planes. Like, I went to the El Toro Air Show when I was a kid, and, like, I remember, like, getting to climb up into the insides of a stealth bomber and watching the Blue Angels, and I have no idea about, like, what those different models are called. But based on my very loose, terrible knowledge, I think an F-35 is a lot more like what the Blue Angels fly than the stealth bomber. So, there you go. That's what I know.
That's true. That is closer to that. So, gather around. Let me tell you a tale. For the F-35, it's actually the most expensive weapon in human history.
Nice.
More money has been spent on it than anything else. The atomic bomb, really big spears, the Atlatl, all of it pales in comparison with the F-35 Joint Strike Fighter.
They've done a terrible job on their marketing then.
The project originates in about 1992 when the military, branches of the military, basically agreed that they needed new fighter planes to refresh and upgrade the American arsenal, which had depended on a lot of planes built and developed in the 70s to the 80s, such as the F-15, the F-16, the F-18, which is what the Blue Angels fly.
Okay.
And close attack planes like the A-10. None of this will mean anything if you don't know fighter planes, but
Like
they're
me.
they're really fast and they're like pointed and they go places. If you're familiar with Top Gun, by the way, they flew F-14 Tomcats, which are no longer in service. So about the same time period, though. Well, so the military wanted to basically consolidate a lot of its fighter jets into fewer planes. The political rationale was, okay, if all three services are behind this project, there won't be so much infighting over budgets, and we can reduce our maintenance and production costs and get all the services behind one plane, which became the Joint Strike Fighter program, which was awarded to Lockheed Martin in 2001 after their prototype was chosen. And the main requirements were the Marines really wanted a plane that could take off vertically, like the Harrier jump jet, if you're familiar with that.
Nope.
Okay, well, they want a plane that could take off on a near vertical surface without having to like taxi on a runway, and could also land similarly.
So go up.
Go up, yes.
And down.
Yes. There's that requirement. The Navy needed it to be sufficient to land on aircraft carriers, and the Air Force just needed it to fly. They're chill. The problem is that to get a plane that is able to take off vertically requires a lot of downward thrust. So they basically had to design the engine to have a huge fan on the fuselage, that's kind of the body of the plane, which compromised the plane from the beginning because the fuselage had to be huge, and the wings had to be fairly small to fit on an aircraft carrier. Which means that the plane, when it was eventually produced, was a little bit sluggish, was a little bit slower than it should be, and didn't have a very good range. So this plane was intended to really fulfill three basic roles. One of which is close air support. So that means aiding troops on the ground. The second is intercepting, which means basically if enemy planes are attacking, you send out your planes to stop them. And the third is bombing. As it began to develop, it became clear that one, it was hella expensive. It started to emerge that it couldn't really do any of its jobs particularly well. It turns out that because of the small wings and the aerodynamics, it couldn't really like dogfight, like again, Top Gun style. It had poor visibility because pilots, they weren't in like a bubble canopy, but their vision behind them was blocked. Pilots depend on this really fancy helmet to see what's going on around them, which feeds all sorts of electronic signals and mumbo jumbo that I don't understand. And there were software bugs with that, issues with like double targets. There were massive cost overruns, up to 50% to double the original cost estimates. The weapon systems were a little bit limited, like the cannon that shoots, the guns could only had a couple hundred rounds versus...
I know what guns are.
Yeah, they're the ones that go pew, pew, pew.
Right.
Only had a couple hundred rounds versus some of the planes they were replacing, which had up to over 1,000 rounds, which really limited its capabilities there. And as an interceptor, it was inferior to a lot of planes that were decades older in terms of just the ability to shoot missiles and stuff. So kind of a limited plane, really big problems. The one thing that it did excel at and was supposed to excel at was being in advanced electronics. So it basically acts as a giant router in the sky. It has all these fancy sensors that collect information and can disperse it to other planes to give a lot of really strong battlefield awareness so that pilots all across the theater have a greater sense of what's happening in a given situation, which apparently is pretty important for military air-to-air combat. I wouldn't know. I've never done it. So you've got this plane that has been enormously expensive, not necessarily good at a lot of things that fighter jets are supposed to be good at, but has become, basically, as some people say anyway, it's too big to fail. They've put so much money into it over the decades.
Can't give up on it.
Yeah, there are a lot of fingers in this pie. It's being produced over a lot of different states, as military projects are. There's financing from foreign governments, NATO allies, who have already committed to buy up a bunch of the planes. So the big problem was that essentially the plane is built to operate in a hypothetical war situation that we aren't really dealing with now. So I've in my personal life, I'm sort of a pretty big critic of the way U.S. handles its foreign relations and wars and whatever. But the fact is, jets are cool, and I kind of I'm interested in them.
Right.
And this plane is built to prepare for kind of a future great powers war, like if we're fighting our big war against Russia or China or whatever. And all the stuff that, from the Cold War that they still dream about reenacting. But the reality is the majority of what the U.S. military engages in now are more counterinsurgency as we go and, screw up Middle Eastern countries. Right. And this plane is not really suited to that, particularly in close air support, because the sort of the main plane that does that job now is the A-10 Warthog. And it's basically able to fly really low and slow to do multiple passes, kind of strafing bad guys or installations with the guns. This plane is not really capable of doing that because it's too fast, it doesn't have enough ammo, and it can't really fly low enough to be protected from small arms fire,
Awesome.
which is kind of a big liability
Yeah.
when that's the jet that is supposed to replace your entire fleet. And the Air Force has actually tried to deliberately sabotage the A-10 program because they really put a lot of effort into the Joint Strike Fighter succeeding.
Okay, hang on. Backpedal just a little bit. Did you ever say when this project started and like when it's supposed to finish?
So it started in 1992.
Awesome.
The prototype was awarded in 2001. So it's been, decades.
Awesome.
So to
Love
put,
it.
by way of comparison, previous jets took maybe 10 years to get up and combat ready. This one has been, 25 some odd years.
Yeah.
So really great program. And weirdly enough, the kinds of people who really love responsible government spending tend to be okay with programs like this. I don't know that. But frankly, like a lot of very prominent politicians on both sides have come out, and even though there have been criticisms of the program, there's been a lot of sort of back channel support because nobody wants to be seen as undermining the troops or whatever.
Right. And like sunk cost fallacy and
and it gives jobs to people in the states who are producing them. So
right.
So it's a really
That part's good.
it's great for everybody except for maybe the people who actually have to fly the things, or I don't know if like the military is actually called on to use them. So we're at a point now where I think the planes are starting to be, they're still actually being deployed and tested at the same time. It's a thing called concurrency, where I think the U.S. ordered like 2,500 or so. They've gotten about 200. But the problem is, as problems are discovered and set for repairs, they have to basically refurbish all the old models that have already been purchased with the new updates.
Right.
So that's proven to be one of the main drivers of the costs. But they're coming online now. There's still a lot of software for the plane that's still in development. And based on things I've read, we won't actually know its full combat effectiveness or capabilities until maybe the mid-2020s.
Jeez.
So we've got all these planes that are coming into service, and frankly, we don't really know how good they are. It could be that they're very effective and they do exactly what they're supposed to do, what they've been promised to do. But there have been a lot of failed tests and things like them getting outfought by, 30-year-old fighters in tests. There have been other recent operations, kind of war games, where they've supposedly been very effective. And again, their main asset is the ability to relay communications in advanced wireless ways and all sorts of acronyms that I don't remember or understand. And that's great. I'll let the people who do that decide how that works. But what we do know is that it has cost so far about... Well, the life cycle cost estimates for this program is supposed to be about $1.4 trillion right now.
Awesome.
Yeah. Over its however long the program is supposed to last. That's an estimate, by the way. And they've been wrong about every estimate so far. So let's assume it's before that. It costs about $12.5 billion per year. To put that in perspective, that's about 1/3 of the budget of HUD, Housing Urban Development.
And friendly reminder that we're defunding arts programs that take up tiny percentage of that.
Yeah. Every individual jet costs about $200 million, which is 2 to 3 times what the comparable planes in the arsenal cost typically.
You know how many kids you could educate with that money?
Also, you could pay for the repairs to all of the city of Flint's water pipes, if, for example, that were a political issue anybody cared about doing, for the price of a single plane that may or may not do what it's supposed to do 5 years from now.
I think the listeners are getting the idea that you and I have certain feelings about military spending.
Yeah, so I'm pro badass military equipment. I just wish we'd stop using it the way we do. Anyway.
Yeah.
Because I like them when they in video simulations and games because they're fun. Because that's my entry into this world, is playing those old Jane's combat games, which were great. Anyway, that's kind of where we stand now. The Joint Strike Fighter is going to be the United States' main close air support fighter in the future anyway.
Cool.
Yeah, but that's the Joint Strike Fighter. Also, I guess it looks kind of cool.
I'm sure it does.
Yeah.
You'll have to show me a picture.
I will.
And I'll just throw out another plug for the Blue Angels because they're pretty cool.
Yeah, they actually fly FA-18 Super Hornets, which are cool planes.
They are cool planes.
Yeah, that's one.
And they maneuver like crazy.
Yeah,
it's awesome to watch.
That's one of the suggested alternatives to the F-35 is that you could upgrade the old F-18. They don't have the same stealth capabilities because they weren't built from the ground up that way. But there's also arguments that stealth is not as important as it used to be because anyway, radar and stuff. That's all
Right.
stuff that we don't need to get into.
Yeah.
But the point is the Blue Angels are cool, and I've never seen them, and I want to.
I highly recommend it. Well, thanks, listeners, for listening to us again, as you do on our podcast. We're going to have another month break, probably one more month break after that. So we'll do like one in May and one in June. And then I think we could actually go back to our every 2-week format because Casey's going to graduate soon. So we're on Twitter at NQR_podcast. But that's pretty much it. Anyway.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye.